Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about the failure of compromise, the election of 1860, and secession, and today we are talking about military conflict and government policies during the Civil War. So if you are ready, let's begin. We're going to talk about the beginning of the war first, but I want to make sure everyone understands that a couple of vocab terms here. All right. So when we're discussing things, right, we have the North is called the Union and the South is called the Confederacy. All right. But how does the Civil War actually begin? Now, we know after Abraham Lincoln's election that South Carolina and other states left the Union because they did not think that Abraham Lincoln should be president. So that was a total of 7 states had left the Union by March of 1861. Now, when Lincoln is inaugurated as president, he basically says in his inaugural address that he's not going to interfere with slavery where it already is, but he also makes it very clear that states do not have the right to secede. And so what starts to happen is there's an issue because the Union, the North, has troops in this fort called Fort Sumter, which I actually got to go visit a couple of months ago. So they actually have troops there, and it's like a small island off of South Carolina. But the issue is South Carolina seceded, and they're a part of the Confederacy, right? So we can see that it's a little bit sticky here. So Lincoln decides that he needs to send some provisions to the soldiers that are at Fort Sumter, which you see pictured here on the right. Now, he's not sending reinforcements, he's sending provisions to try to make it so that the soldiers living there, can stay there a little bit longer. However, the Confederacy decides to attack Fort Sumter in April 12th, 1861. And you can see pictured on the right, that's a little painting of the attack. And this officially begins the Civil War. Okay, so now that the Civil War has begun and we can, America can tell that violence is going to be needed to bring the Union back together, both the North, which again is the Union, and the South, the Confederacy, need to mobilize their economies and their societies. And what mobilizing means in a war is means you need to get, your factories ready, your troops where they need to be, your guns, your ammo, all that kind of stuff. You need the food, right? Everything needs to be ready to go. Okay, so a couple of ways that the North are going to do this is that Lincoln is going to call for volunteers to fight, but he's also going to need to use a draft. And both the North and the South are going to need to use a draft. But in the North, it gets very hostile. Riots get started. There's this example called the New York City draft riots, where the people who are drafted are actually rioting because they don't believe that they should have to be drafted into the war. Okay. And so at the very beginning of this war, Lincoln's priority is to keep the border states in the Union. Okay. And so the border states are like Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. Now, these are states that have slavery, right, but are still a part of the Union. So Lincoln thinks we need to make sure we keep them in. And on the South, they rally around the idea of the Confederacy. 4 more states join them. And so they are, kind of ready to go. So this is kind of how they're mobilizing their soldiers. But it's also important to know that opposition is persisting in both regions. So not everyone's just on board with this idea that we need to go to war. So in the North, Maryland's newspapers are being very critical of Lincoln. Lincoln actually goes so far as to shut them down. And like we talked about, those New York City draft riots, right, where they're upset because you could pay actually money to get out of the draft, and so they feel like it's unfairly targeting poor people in the draft. And then in the South, a lot of the farmers refused to fight because, they didn't want their slaves to fight, but they thought if they left that their slaves would run away and all that. So there's still some opposition, even though this war is definitely underway. All right, now we're going to discuss a little bit of Lincoln's goals. And it's really important to note this first idea that in the beginning, this war is about preserving the Union. It's about the idea that secession is not legal. It is not about eliminating slavery. Okay, so Lincoln has a lot of fear from different white workers in the North, and he has political concerns with the Northern Democrats, right? Not everyone voted for Lincoln in the North. And so he needs to be very careful about how he's approaching the beginning of this war. So again, it's about preserving the Union in the beginning for Lincoln. It's not about ending slavery. But as the war goes on, it becomes more and more about slavery. So September 22nd, 1862, a huge event in the Civil War. It's called the Emancipation Proclamation. And this is basically a a law, sort of, that Lincoln puts in that basically declares that all slaves in areas of rebellion would be free. So this means that all the slaves that were in the Confederacy would be free. Now, this does not apply to border states. Now, if you're hearing this, it should be confusing, right? Because if, let's say, you're South Carolina, are you going to listen to Lincoln saying that the slaves in your area are free, right? So the southern states, the Confederacy, don't feel like the North and Lincoln has any authority to do this. But Lincoln does it for a couple of reasons. One, it's like a military reason because there's the idea that if the slaves hear that they're free, that maybe they'll escape their slavery, and maybe the soldiers in the Southern armies, the Confederate armies, might run back because they need to take care of their own farm and make sure their slaves are there. But it also helps change the purpose of the war, and this becomes more of like a moral cause for the North. Okay, and then the last big help of the Emancipation Proclamation is that it makes sure that European countries are not going to support the Confederacy. Right. So at this point in 1862, slavery is banned in Europe. Europeans are not going to support the Confederacy after this idea of slavery becomes the main focus of the war. And also, another important to note about Lincoln's goals is that a lot of African Americans are going to enlist in the Union Army, even though they have to fight in segregated units. They're paid less than whites. It does still show how African Americans are dedicated to their cause. And it does show a shift here from the beginning, when the war is about preserving the Union, to the end, where it becomes more and more about the issue of slavery itself. Okay, now this is a key concept. This slide's titled Personal Liberties During the War. And this is a key concept for the Civil War, but for all wars. And we've seen this at other times. Okay, so when America is at war, a lot of the time, people's freedoms are restricted. And this is very true during the Civil War as well. So there's a idea in America called habeas corpus, okay, within our Constitution. And it's a concept that basically says you can't be put in jail unless there are charges against you, right? We can't just throw random people in jail. And during the war, Lincoln decides to suspend habeas corpus, meaning he's not going to follow that. And he's going to start to put people in jail without charging them, okay? And Congress is supposed to be the only one that can suspend this, but Lincoln decides to do it, okay? Some other examples of how Lincoln does this, he orders a blockade of the South without getting approval from Congress. Okay. He increases the size of the federal army through those drafts, again, without getting approval from Congress. So there's a lot of things Lincoln does without approval from Congress in order to try to help the Union and the North win the war. And there's even a Supreme Court case about this habeas corpus situation called Ex parte Merryman, which is the name of the Supreme Court case. I'm not really sure why it's named that, but it's in 1861. And basically the Supreme Court says the president can't suspend habeas corpus. Like, Lincoln was wrong for doing this. Lincoln doesn't care. He ignores it, does it anyway. Kind of reminds me of the Trail of Tears, Worcester versus Georgia, where they say that basically Andrew Jackson can't evict the Native Americans, and he does it anyway. Lincoln does the same thing. But in this sense, he's doing it to try to preserve the Union. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit of politics during the war, because both sides have some challenges, and eventually, obviously, the North has some successes. So what are the challenges for the South, for the Confederacy? Well, they're going to try to use something called cotton diplomacy to get more people, more other countries on their side, right? So the idea here is that obviously we know the South is a main supplier of cotton, not only for the United States, but for the entire world. And Europe, the South is kind of hoping that Europe is going to need the cotton from the South. And so that's how the South is going to get some, help from Europe in this war. But Europe's going to start to obtain cotton from other sources. And the Confederacy is going to fail at a big battle called the Battle of Antietam, which is one of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War. And that kind of is the beginning, almost the beginning of the end for the South. And then after the Emancipation Proclamation comes in, right, a lot of different European countries are not going to want to support the South that's so in favor of slavery. And the other challenge for the Confederacy is this idea that the concept of states' rights, right, that the states should be the ones deciding their own laws and not the federal government. That's one of their ideas about why they should have slavery in the South. Well, that conflicts often with the central government of the Confederacy, right? The Confederacy, the Southern states put in their own central government. And if the states don't want to do something that the Confederacy says they have to do, right, there's a challenge, there's a problem there, okay, with this central tenet of states' rights instead of rights of the central government. Okay, so challenges for Lincoln is basically one concept is that there's a lot of radical Republicans that want to end slavery. They're abolitionists. They want to end slavery right now. And then there's moderates. And then there's also still Democrats, right? And there's people that are called war Democrats that support the war, but they don't think Lincoln's handling it well. And then there's peace Democrats who they don't want the war to happen at all. And they think Lincoln should find a way to get peace to happen. All right. Lincoln still has to run for election in the middle of the Civil War in 1864. And he beats his challenger, McClellan. You can see a picture on the right. He's a Democrat, but Lincoln only wins about 55% of the vote. So I think today we have this idea that everyone was on board with Lincoln in the North. That's just not true, right? So there's a lot of people who did not agree with him. Now, as far as successes for Lincoln, there's a number of laws that get put into place by the Republicans since they controlled in the North the Senate and the House of Representatives and the presidency, right? They controlled all these places of government so that the Republicans were able to put in a lot of laws. They put in laws like tariffs that helped the North pay for their industry. They put in a law called the Homestead Act, which we'll talk about later, but it encourages people to move west, it encourages settlement. He makes it easier for the country to print paper money. He establishes better banking systems. He creates a transcontinental railroad and the Northern Route. So there is some successes that Lincoln and the Republicans are able to do in the North because they are predominantly Republican, like I said, in the House and the Senate and the presidency. Okay, so continuing on with the war, we're going to get to a really key speech. It's called the Gettysburg Address in 1863. And so this is a speech that Lincoln gives at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg. Okay, and this is 4.5 months after the Battle of Gettysburg when the Union defeated the Confederate forces. And Lincoln's hoping in this to reunify the country. And this speech is really where the Civil War goals change from preserving the Union to ending slavery. Okay. And Lincoln references this idea of a new birth of freedom to ensure that all men are truly created equal. And so this is a really key turning point where we start to see again the moral cause of the North about slavery become the main purpose of the war. Okay, so we're almost there, but we got to figure out last slide here. But why does the Union win, right? So the Union, obviously, as we know, they win this war. Slavery is eventually going to end, but how do they do it? Okay, so one key thing is improvements in the Northern leadership and strategy. Okay, so at the beginning of the war, the Northern generals are not doing very well, and the South has huge advantages in generals. Okay, they're fighting a defensive war. They have generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson who are much more successful than the Northern generals. But eventually, Northern generals like Sherman and Grant become more successful as the war moves on. There's a famous plan called the Anaconda Plan, where the Anaconda Plan is where they're going to blockade the South. So they're going to make it so that the South can't get any trading in and out because the South doesn't have any navy. The Confederacy doesn't have any navy. So that's one idea. There's also a couple of key victories that help the North. Okay, so in Antietam, now I talked about Antietam as a Union victory, but it's also, a lot of times it's talked about as a tie as well. Okay, so I might have misspoke earlier. But the idea here is that it's a strategic victory for the North because it's a very bloody battle, but it's a morale boost. It helps keep Europe out of the war. And the Emancipation Proclamation is going to be issued after this battle, which is another one of the reasons why it helps keep Europe out of the war. And then at Gettysburg and the issuance of the Gettysburg Address later is going to be another key victory for the North. And the Gettysburg Address, again, we talked about how it changes from being about preserving the Union to being more about slavery. Okay, some other reasons why the Union won. Greater resources. Okay, so the North, we know, has factories. They have industries. They have more manufacturing. They have more railroads, okay? They're the ones with the Navy and the established government. They have more people, okay? Those are huge advantages, okay? Now, they do lack, like I said, some leadership, especially in the beginning. But the idea of the increased population and the more factories and the fact that they have 180,000 African Americans that are going to serve in this war, even though they're facing prejudice, right? All these advantages and these resources are going to make it easier for the North to prevail. Whereas in the South, right, they don't have as strong of a government structure. They just had to create it recently. Okay, they're poorly equipped. They don't have a railroad system. They don't have as many factories to produce guns and cannons and all this, right? So it's tough for the South to be successful. And then one of the last reasons that the North and the Union win is the destruction of the South's infrastructure. So there's this famous idea by Sherman, one of those generals we talked about earlier for the North. It's called Sherman's March to the Sea. And that's what's pictured here on the right. And the idea is like basically total war, that as Sherman marches south, he's going to burn and destroy everything in the South. It's going to make it difficult for the South to rebuild. It's going to make it difficult for the South to produce anything from their farms or from their factories, right? So these are some reasons why the Union wins the Civil War. And the Union does, in fact, win the Civil War. And that's huge. All right. So that's it for the slides today about military conflict and government policies during the Civil War. But we got to go over our big ideas. Okay. So, what are some ideas that the South and North have in common when fighting the Civil War? How did Lincoln's goals change throughout the Civil War? That's really important. And then, third, why did the Union win the Civil War? All right. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.